welcome back to the History of Video Games Part 4. Today we're taking a look at the third generation of video game consoles. With each of these videos, I always feel like I want to use the names of these console generations that either I've made up or I've heard other people use. So I want to always talk about the Pong era or the Atari era, and therefore I kind of want to talk about this era with the name that most people call it by, which is, of course, this is the Nintendo era. Yes, Nintendo finally coming into the picture, but before we get to Nintendo, there is someone else we have to talk about. Yes, we're talking about you, Sega. Now, it might interest you to know that Sega, although a Japanese-based company, was not originally founded in Japan. You might be surprised to find out Sega was actually founded on Hawaii in the 1950s, and what they originally did was create all kinds of entertainment equipment for soldiers stationed there. But in the 1950s, the company moved its headquarters to Japan, and so technically they are a Japanese company. But this also explains the origins of Sega's name. It was originally Service Games. So like a lot of other companies, Nintendo included, they took to making arcade machines, not making games themselves, but basically making arcade games in the 1960s and 70s. And Sega themselves finally entered the video game business in the early 1980s. 1981, they came out with two space shooter titles, and space shooters were really the most common kind of game at this point, which were Space Fury and Star Trek. So Sega kind of launched off in a big way with a big name brand title like that, and therefore it's no surprise why in 1982 Sega became Japan's first console manufacturer when they released the SG-1000. Now the SG-1000 was indeed a big hitter in Asia, and it is very notable because no other company in Japan had really tried to become a console manufacturer at this point in time. There was also a kind of call for it because Atari didn't actually enter Japanese markets until 1983. But the SG-1000 unfortunately proves, once again, the point, just because you're first doesn't make you the best. Yes, only a year later, Nintendo came out with the Famicom console. Finally, we're coming to Nintendo. Yes, Nintendo founded in 1889. Wait. Yes, 1889. Jesus Christ. Nintendo is over 100 years old. Nintendo is older than my country has been an independent nation. So yes, Nintendo was originally founded in 1889 as a Hanafuda card game company, and this is a business that they really were into for about 60 years. Then, like a lot of other video game companies, before heading into video games, Nintendo flirted around with a lot of different business ideas, toys, a taxi service, and most disturbingly of all, a chain of love hotels. And of course in the mid-70s, like I mentioned, the Magnavox Odyssey arrived in Japan, imported by Nintendo, and Nintendo probably used this as the basis of their TV Color 5, which was a Pong machine in itself, released a little too late, unfortunately, in 1977 no less. But Nintendo finally did become a big hitter in the video game business in 1981 when they released Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong wasn't just a big hit in Japan, it was also extremely important for Nintendo's future that the game became amazingly popular in North America. It was then imported to other parts of the world, it was largely imitated, it was even released to most of the major systems of the time. So Nintendo had, at a relatively early phase in their history in video gaming, achieved a level of fame which was unequaled by any other company, not even Taito, who admittedly became the first big Japanese video game company when they released Space Invaders. And I think that unfortunately we're gonna notice along the lines of history is that Japan just loves Nintendo, but they don't really care that much about Sega. A point that illustrates this probably the best is the Famicom came out almost a full year after the SG-1000, at which point Sega was already releasing a second version of their console in order to be ready to compete with the Famicom. The very first batch of Famicom systems actually had a faulty unit in them that made them unplayable, much like the Red Ring of Death in the very early Xbox 360s, which caused a major recall of Famicom systems. And in spite of this, the Famicom had outsold the SG-1000 within a year. In other words, Nintendo's name value was enough to keep it afloat even after they experienced their first major hiccup already upon the arrival of their new system. Of course, after Nintendo had become the biggest console manufacturer of their own country, the next logical step was America. Oh, but wait. Well, I'm gonna be talking about Nintendo a lot in this video, so I'm gonna jump to the important part. After a massive redesign and a renaming of their home system, as well as convincing American retailers by cooking up the story how it was an educational computer and also came with this funny little robot toy, bam! Nintendo releases Super Mario Bros., one of the most influential video games up to that point, and becomes the dominating system of its generation. Now, Sega probably were a little bitter about the fact that they were getting their ass handed to by Nintendo already this early in the game, but they saw that Nintendo could make it in America, so they decided, well, we have to go there as well. So they took their latest version of the SG-1000 line of systems, the Sega Mark III, added some new components in it, gave it a flashy new design, and renamed it much like the Famicom. Nintendo Entertainment System, Sega Master System, notice a similarity there? But unfortunately, upon arriving to America, Sega committed a first in a long line of bad business decisions that would plague their later history. Rather than marketing the system themselves, Sega decided to save some money and let somebody else do it, and of course, they gave the rights to a toy company. And you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal? Like, other toy companies had video game consoles before. Mattel, Coleco? Yes, but this was not one of those toy companies. Oh, yes, this was Tonka. Tonka, who had absolutely no history in marketing a video game system, had absolutely no idea what to do with the Master System, and what illustrates this perhaps the best is all the horrible cover art that you can find for Master System games, because for some reason they just didn't want to use the Japanese cover arts. I think cover art like this really says a lot about Tonka's ability to market the Master System. So Sega had its ass royally handed to them back by Nintendo for a second time, but there was one market area where the Master System actually was pretty popular. Europe, because we have to remember at this point in time the European Union didn't exist. Well, it sort of did, but it wasn't called that, and the Iron Wall was still up. So Nintendo was actually having some problems bringing the NES to all these European countries. In fact, some of them didn't receive it until the 90s. So Sega had a marketing edge there. There were some countries that they were able to push the Master System as an alternative to those who could not get an NES. And in the aftermath of all of this, there was in fact one American console company that still tried to make it in the game. Oh boy. Yes, it's our old friend Atari. Yes, apparently even after going bankrupt, Atari decided, hey, they're making video games again, let's jump in. So in 1987, the Atari 7800 came out, but if the Master System was having a lot of problems competing with Nintendo, you can only imagine what sort of problems the Atari 7800 had. Now technologically, and from a design point of view, the 7800 was actually a pretty good system. The problem was that absolutely no one was making games for it. The Atari 7800 had less than 100 original titles before Atari discontinued it. And to be perfectly fair, some of this wasn't entirely Atari's own fault. And we will look at now why Nintendo was so overtly dominant. Now, one of Nintendo's outstanding innovations in this console generation was the modern concept of what a gamepad was, and this design was obviously copied by every single video game company since. However, there was something even more important that Nintendo innovated, which really was instrumental in keeping another video game crash like the one in 1984 from ever happening again, and that was introducing licensing agreements. So yes, from here on out, every single company that wanted to make a game for a video game system had to pay a licensing fee to the console manufacturer to get the proper rights, and this way not only did the console manufacturers get a cut out of it, it also gave them a certain level of quality control, which I'll admit most console manufacturers are piss poor at monitoring, but point being, there would be a lot more shitty games out if we didn't have licensing agreements. As much of a Nintendo fan as I am, there is no way that I cannot bring up Nintendo's seal of quality without also bringing up its dark side. Licensing agreements were a really good thing, but Nintendo was also the first and probably the only company in history to massively abuse them. Okay, so Nintendo limited the amount of games that companies could release for the NES to 5 games a year, which in my view is a perfectly reasonable number. Of course, some companies like Konami did find ways to get around that, but this was fairly harmless, as Nintendo would have probably noticed if too many other companies were doing the same thing. However, far more questionable was the practice of keeping games exclusive to the NES. Now, if you had a very popular game, say in the arcades, or maybe on the Amiga 500 or something like that, and you ported it over to the NES, you were in the clear. You could go and pretty much release that game to other systems, provided that you paid the licensing agreements. But God help you, if your game was first released on the NES, then you were not permitted to release that game for any other system for up to 3 years. Seriously, is it any wonder why there were no Castlevania games on the Master System, or Mega Man games for that matter? So Sega may have royally fucked up the release of the Master System in the United States, but there were in fact other reasons why people didn't want to play it, and that was basically because they did not have the same games, and could not have the same games as the NES. And another unfortunate aspect of this whole licensing agreement thing, of course, before this, there was no such thing as video game piracy, which is something that Nintendo is very hell-bent on fighting. So with the birth of licensing agreements, we have the birth of video game piracy, and I present to you now our friend Tengen. In their day, Tengen could have been considered the last big anarchists of the video game industry, but from a modern perspective, all they were was just a pirate games company. So basically, Tengen were unwilling to submit to Nintendo's iron fist of licensing fees. They went around the NES's lockout ships, made games illegally, and for a while, Nintendo didn't really care that much. Okay, so Tengen would release a few illegal games, Nintendo would find out, they would get recalled, and then next year Tengen would release another illegal game. And this went back and forth until Tengen committed the ultimate faux pas, which was to release Tetris for the NES. Now Tetris is another big issue that I'm not gonna even get into, but what basically happened with Tetris is that it's the one game in history that has been accidentally released to more platforms than any other. Unfortunately, Tengen was on the wrong side of the fight, when it turned out Nintendo was the only proper license holder for Tetris. Before Tengen went out in all their piratey glory, they did call out Nintendo on their bullshit and their questionable business practices, and Nintendo did react by loosening its policies. So I think we've covered all the basic areas of this generation, which is why I want to now discuss something a little bit more trivial but still important for our course. In what years did this generation actually take place? I mean, let's think about it. The SG-1000 was already released in 1982, the Famicom released already in 1983, and as we remember, the last console generation ended with the 1984 video game crash. If you prescribe to the belief that this generation took place between Anno Domini 1985 to 1990, I wouldn't argue with you. But, unfortunately, reality rejects simplicity. 1990 is only a good arguing point if you argue that the next console generation starts with the arrival of the Super Nintendo, which of course it didn't, because there were already two 16-bit systems on the market, as we will learn in 1988. 2 came out. What's keeping us from arguing that the Intellivision and the ColecoVision weren't in fact part of this third generation, apart from the fact that they were discontinued in 1984? Well, this gives us a good dividing marker, because we can kind of talk about the third generation really starting when the video game business was getting re-established in North America, and by extension in most parts of the world. It's important because this establishes a long connecting bridge between Japan and Europe. And although the release of the Master System was royally fucked, Sega did stick to their guns. The Master System continued well after Sega released their next system. In fact, the Master System and the NES are two of the most long-lived consoles ever. The NES was not discontinued until 1995. I mean, it encompasses a time period of over a decade. But I just want to bring this point out, because this is what I was talking about before, that with some console generations, it's just not inherently obvious where one generation starts. And I think we can definitely say that this console generation either begins in 83 and 85. And if you want to make the point, it ends in the early 90s. Because by then, there was something far more interesting and far more relevant going on. My question for next time is a true or false question, so we'll see who's right and who's wrong. Did blast processing really exist? See you on the next one. It's me, Mario. Hey, I'm a plumber from Brooklyn. I'm gonna be under your sink. Well, you can see the crack of my ass. Woohoo! What are you looking at? So I like mushrooms. What's the big deal? Woohoo! Almost a full year after the SG-1000. at which point Sega was already